You might think your hours in the gym, your boxing classes, or even your gaming reflexes would give you a chance against a medieval knight. But the brutal truth? You wouldn't last a heartbeat. The clash between peasants and knights isn't the fairy tale you've been told. History has been wrapped in romantic myths. Peasants painted as fragile, mud-covered nobodies, and knights glorified as untouchable titans of honor. Yet when you strip away the legends, the reality is far more raw and far more shocking. Peasants were not helpless victims waiting to be slaughtered. Their bodies were forged by relentless labor, hauling stones, cutting wood, tilling soil from dawn until dusk. That strength, paired with desperation, turned them into dangerous opponents when pushed to the edge. Knights, on the other hand, weren't noble duelists in shining armor. They were professional predators, trained killers who lived for war. This isn't the story of heroes and fodder. It's the story of survival, brutality, and the collapse of illusions. As you step into this forgotten world, you'll see how both peasants and knights carried weapons, fears, and strengths far different from what Hollywood ever dared to show. Everything you thought you knew is about to be torn apart. When you picture a knight, what comes to mind? A gleaming suit of armor, a noble figure on horseback, saluting before a duel. Hollywood has drilled that image into our heads. Slow-moving juggernauts, weighed down by steel, stumbling across muddy fields while peasants scatter before them. But history tells a much darker story, one that shatters the romance and exposes the knight for what he truly was. A knight wasn't a clumsy ornament of war. He was a predator, bred and built for violence from childhood. By the age of 7, noble boys were sent to train as pages, then squires, absorbing years of discipline, horsemanship, wrestling, swordsmanship, and survival tactics. They weren't just swinging blades. They drilled until combat was instinct, until killing was second nature. By the time they earned their spurs, these men were lean, powerful, and terrifyingly efficient. Armor, far from making them sluggish, gave them an edge. A full suit of plate weighed about 40–60 pounds, no heavier than the gear carried by modern soldiers. Knights could sprint, climb ladders, wrestle, and fight for hours while wrapped in steel. Their mobility often shocked enemies who expected lumbering statues. And forget the myth of the honorable duel. Knights weren't playing by chivalric fairy tale codes on the battlefield. In war, they gouged, crushed, and slaughtered with brutal efficiency. They trampled peasants under horses, smashed skulls with maces, and used shock tactics to terrify entire villages into submission. To peasants, a knight wasn't a noble savior. He was the monster at the door. The romantic knight of legend is a product of poetry and propaganda, a story written by those who needed the masses to believe in noble protectors. But peel away the propaganda, and what you find is a professional killer wrapped in iron, thriving in a world where survival meant domination. And this is where the real contrast emerges. If knights were apex predators, how did peasants, untrained, poorly armed and desperate, ever manage to stand against them? The answer lies not in fantasy, but in the harsh realities of strength, unity, and the will to survive. The word peasant often conjures images of frail, starving farmers, skinny, men in rags, powerless before the armored elite. That image is a myth crafted by chronicles written from the perspective of nobility, not reality. The truth: medieval peasants were some of the toughest, strongest, and most resilient human beings of their age. Their bodies were not shaped in gyms or sparring halls, but in endless fields of labor, where survival depended on muscle and endurance. Imagine the life of a farmer, dawn to dusk labor in harsh conditions. They swung heavy scythes to cut acres of grain, hauled water by the bucketful, chopped thick logs, pushed plows through stubborn soil, and carried sacks weighing more than a modern soldier's pack. This wasn't occasional exercise, it was daily, necessity. Over years it forged raw strength and stamina that modern desk-bound humans can barely comprehend. Peasants didn't need training programs. Their very survival was training. And when pushed to rebellion or defense, those tools of labor became weapons of war. A scythe could slice through flesh as easily as wheat. A flail, designed to thresh grain, could smash a knight's helmet with terrifying force. Axes, picks, and hammers, all common farm tools, became instruments of defiance. What knights saw as crude improvisations were in reality familiar extensions of a peasant's daily life. They wielded them with confidence because these tools had been in their hands since childhood. Numbers, too, mattered. A lone peasant stood little chance, but villages didn't rise alone. They rose together. Bands of dozens, sometimes hundreds, confronted armored lords. Desperation gave them unity, and unity bred courage. When survival meant protecting family and livelihood, peasants fought with a ferocity knights rarely encountered on open battlefields. And there was another hidden advantage: terrain. Peasants knew their land intimately. Every ditch, swamp, hedge, and hill. They turned fields into traps, forests into ambush points, and rivers into barricades. Knights might dominate on open ground, but drag them into marshes or narrow lanes, and their horses faltered, their armor became a prison, and their advantage crumbled. History offers countless moments where peasants proved far more dangerous than nobles expected. They weren't lambs led to slaughter. They were wolves disguised in wool, ready to bare their teeth when cornered. The idea that peasants were helpless against knights is one of history's most enduring lies. In truth, they were men and women, hardened by labor, bound by necessity, and sharpened by desperation. And when that desperation boiled over, even the most formidable knight could find himself dragged down in mud, overwhelmed by the strength of those he once dismissed as nothing. The question is no longer whether peasants had the strength to fight. It's how far that strength could carry them when facing the most lethal warriors of their age. If strength and endurance gave peasants the foundation to resist, training and tactics defined how battles played out. On one side stood the knight, shaped by years of rigorous martial education, polished equipment, and a worldview centered on dominance. On the other side, the peasant, self-taught through necessity, improvisation, and the shared memory of generations who had endured oppression. This clash of preparation and desperation reveals more than a simple gap in skill. It exposes the creative ways common people learn to outthink professional killers. Knights were products of a lifetime of combat discipline. Their training began at childhood, with endless drills in swordplay, wrestling, archery, horsemanship, and jousting. They practiced in mock battles, refined strikes to muscle memory, and fought under the weight of armor until it felt like a second skin. By adulthood, they weren't simply strong, they were specialists. Knights understood formation tactics, shock charges with cavalry, and how to exploit fear on the battlefield. Peasants, by contrast, lacked formal schools of war. Their training was the grind of survival, swinging an axe at wood, steering, heavy plows, lifting loads no noble child could dream of. Yet when conflict arrived, their ingenuity surfaced. They adapted what they knew into strategies the knights often underestimated. A blacksmith forged nails into caltrops to cripple horses. Farmers tied wagons together to create barricades. Hunters with bows became invaluable snipers from forest edges. What knights dismissed as crude improvisation often proved devastatingly effective. One of the greatest weapons of the peasant was collective coordination. Individual skill could not rival a knight's mastery. But when dozens of villagers stood shoulder to shoulder with pikes, flails, or axes, they created an unbreakable wall of human will. This is how militia forces like the Flemish guildsmen, at the Battle of Courtrai in 1302, shattered heavily armoured cavalry. Armed not with knightly swords but with long pikes and terrain traps, they turned noble horsemen into corpses strewn in muddy fields. Knights relied on intimidation and speed. Their horses thundered into ranks, their weapons cleaved through flesh, and their armor shrugged off weak blows. But peasants adapted through patience. They dragged knights into marshy ground, where horses stumbled, or into narrow village streets, where cavalry charges became useless. They struck from ambush, emerging from hedges and woodlands, overwhelming one rider with 10 men. Their lack of rigid structure made them unpredictable, a nightmare for knights accustomed to order. The psychology of tactics also played a role. Knights were raised with the confidence of superiority, taught that their title and training made them invincible. But peasants, driven by desperation, fought with survival in their veins. Fear could paralyze, yes, but when communities fought for their families, their courage could ignite into something knights struggled to contain. It would be a mistake to romanticize peasants as flawless underdogs. Many uprisings failed, crushed beneath armored hooves. Yet every rebellion, every battle where villagers dragged down mounted nobles, revealed cracks in the myth of invincibility. Over time, these cracks widened into chasms, reshaping the very balance of medieval warfare. The stage was set for moments when peasants not only resisted, but triumphed. And to see this most clearly, we must step onto the battlefield itself, where mud, steel, and blood told the real story of what happened when knights met the people they underestimated. To truly understand how the myth unraveled, we must step into the chaos of a medieval battlefield, a place where the clash of knights and peasants wasn't abstract, but blood-soaked reality. Few examples reveal this more vividly than the Battle of Courtrai in 1302, also called the Battle of the Golden Spurs. Here, the stage seemed set for a noble victory. French knights, armoured and mounted, charged forward with confidence, expecting to sweep aside the Flemish militia. Against them stood men who, on paper, had no chance. Guildsmen, farmers, townsfolk wielding pikes and repurposed tools. Yet the terrain told a different story. The Flemish positioned themselves behind, ditches and marshy ground, forcing the French cavalry into traps. Horses stumbled, knights toppled, and the peasants closed in with brutal precision. By the end of the day, thousands of knights lay dead, their golden spurs stripped from their boots as trophies. This was not an isolated miracle. Again and again, when peasants fought on their terms, they turned supposed weaknesses into strengths. Their unity created living walls of spears. Their endurance allowed them to outlast charges. Their familiarity with the land gave them a map of every ambush point, every bog where horses would sink, every hill where momentum would die. Knights excelled in open, controlled combat, tournaments, cavalry maneuvers, formal engagements, but war was rarely clean. Mud clogged armor joints. Panic spread when leaders fell. Horses bolted under pikes and arrows, and in those moments, the disciplined knightly order fractured, leaving individuals surrounded by swarms of desperate peasants who attacked with axes, flails, or even bare hands. The reality of battle shattered illusions on both sides. Peasants saw that knights bled and died like any man. Knights, once certain of their dominance, began to fear the uprisings that no armor could fully suppress. Every clash left scars, not only on bodies, but on the social order itself. The brutality of these encounters also reminds us of the cost. Victories were rare, but when peasants triumphed, the aftermath was often drenched in vengeance. Knights, humiliated and slaughtered, became symbols of a crumbling hierarchy. Peasants, in victory, discovered their own strength, and that discovery changed the rhythm of medieval Europe forever. The battlefield was not just a place of death, it was a proving ground where myth collapsed under the weight of reality. And from those muddy fields emerged a new truth, that nobility and armor alone could not secure dominance forever. When the smoke cleared and the blood dried, the clash between peasants and knights left more than corpses behind. It left cracks in the foundations of medieval society. For centuries, knights had been symbols of dominance, their armor shining as proof of divine favor and noble superiority. Yet every battle where peasants stood their ground, every revolt where common men toppled mounted lords, eroded that illusion. Victories, like Courtrai, echoed far beyond the battlefield. They proved that peasants, when united and determined, could shatter the myth of knightly invincibility. This realization sparked waves of uprisings across Europe, revolts in Flanders, England, and France where commoners demanded recognition of their strength. Knights, once feared as unstoppable predators, now had to contend with the knowledge that their rule was not unbreakable. But the legacy was not simply about victory or defeat. It reshaped the very nature of warfare. Armies began to shift from elite cavalry dominance to disciplined infantry formations. Pikemen, longbowmen, and militias drawn from the same common stock once dismissed as fodder. The knight remained a powerful figure, but no longer the sole master of war. And for us today, the lesson is timeless. Strength is not born only of titles or training. It can rise from toil, unity, and sheer will to survive. The peasant, once painted as powerless, proved that even the mightiest predator could fall. So ask yourself, if you stood on that muddy field, would you trust the lone knight in armor, or the wall of peasants fighting for everything they had?